Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined here by Charlie Araujo. Charlie, how are you today?
I am doing great today. We're recording this a little bit early. It's been a crazy week. Lots going on, but it's a fall weather here in New York City is absolutely spectacular, and I've enjoyed bringing down. I'm a Southern Californian, right? And so the idea of having winter clothes and summer clothes, just we just had one set of clothes because it was always the same. And I actually have really come to enjoy the seasonal shift where I now pull down my winter clothes, and it's like this big moment. It's like Christmas is coming, and then as soon as Christmas is over, it's like get me out of here. But uh, so it's been good. How about you?
Yeah, you have fun with that. I did my 20 years in Boston, and I'm happy to be here in California where we no longer have seasons. I'm good with that. But
Well,
also,
you enjoy your non-seasons.
yes, but despite not having seasons, we definitely have seasons of change. Last week, we talked all about the election and all of how this is going to affect tech going forward. And I'm sure we're going to come back to a lot of those segments over time. But, in that, because of that, all the vendors were really quiet last week. They knew what was up, and they knew that trying to compete against the US election was a losing cause from a PR perspective. So they came back out with a vengeance this week, and we definitely saw a lot of announcements, a lot of interesting research coming out, a lot of trends that were being explored around AI and IT, product announcements, acquisitions, all that stuff that we would expect to see week after week definitely came out this week, no doubt.
No shortage. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening right now. And I think we're going to see the pace of change and the pace of news and development continue to increase.
Yeah, and to just dig right into it, one of the first things we saw was a variety of research and articles around AI trends that are currently happening around the usage, around the adoption, around business decisions being made around it. And one of the first ones I know that caught your eye was an Axios story that references Slack study around AI usage at a personal level and at an organizational level. And it looks like that there's some interest in AI, but also that the actual acceleration of adoption seems to be flattening a little bit.
Well, I think it's real. There's actually three separate data points here. There's this article from Axios, which is reporting on a study from Slack that's basically saying employee adoption within enterprises, within organizations, is flattening. That it's basically been at 33%, and it was at 32% during the last study, which I think was, I forgot, a quarter ago or something, right? So it's this
Mm-hmm.
sort of flattening, which in most such situations is not that big of a deal, except this is AI. Everyone's talking about this explosion of opportunity. So you should not be seeing flattening at this stage. And then VentureBeat quoted on a study by the Wharton School of, they've started a new thing. I think it's AI at Wharton or something. But it's Wharton School of Business's AI lab or something. And they did a study where they're seeing almost the exact opposite. Now, what's interesting is this appears to be talking to enterprise or organizational leadership. And here they're saying that there's a massive, like a doubling of usage at a business leader level, that organizations are increasing their spending by more than double, that there's these massive investments all happening. And so you sort of see this dichotomy between the fact that you have the leadership just diving into this, and then the rank and file, the users, the people who are supposed to be using this technology, that it's sort of flattening and there's trepidation and fear. And then the last little data point is Salesforce, which of course made all kinds of news with the release of Agent Force, has hired 1,000 people, 1,000, or is hiring, I guess, 1,000 people, salespeople, to go sell all of this agentic AI technology to all these companies that now have all this budget allocated to it. So you sort of have these like mixed signals about where this is all going. And of course, one commentator I read, tongue in cheek, snarkily said, "Well, wait a minute. This technology is supposed to replace employees, and they had to hire 1,000 employees to go sell it." So, so I don't know. What was your take on these sort of mixing data points?
Yeah, one of the things I found most interesting is that the Slack study, which I would guess does a pretty good job of looking at end user activity based on what they do. They said a third of U.S. workers overall say that they're using AI at work, And then the Wharton study, the VentureBeat article, said that over 70% of business leaders are using AI at work. That is a massive divide between the people at the top and the people, call it, at the middle or at the bottom. And you're going to see these conflicts at work based on these differing perspectives and assumptions. At the top, leaders expect that their middle management and their line level workers will be using AI for basic tasks, for templates, for all these things that you and I are taking for granted at this point. We all expect that if we are doing some sort of cookie cutter work, yeah, let's just start with AI to do all of this. Why wouldn't we? Whether it's summarizing articles or sending out rote emails that are describing corporate based policies. Yeah, we are going to start with AI with that 100% of the time. And that is not filtered down to the line level yet.
I think it's interesting in the Axios article, one of the most staggering numbers to me was they said that 48% of workers, which would apparently be more than the percentage actually using it, 48% are saying that they fear using AI at work because that their managers will see them as lazy or cheating or incompetent because they're using AI. And that would imply, given that number is bigger than the number of actual usage, that that is why some people are in fact not using it. And again, when you put that in contrast to the leadership teams that are not only investing in it but using it, that yeah, I think you do have this divide. And so that's why to me the three data points when I now look at Salesforce out there and obviously investing a whole ton. Like I mean they're on the border of on the edge of betting the company on this.
Yes.
And having to put 1,000 people out to go sell it. And if it doesn't deliver those returns because the users are the employees are afraid to use it or don't know how to use it, we could just see this massive implosion. So I think it was just really sort of fascinating to see all these data points. And I don't think they're necessarily in conflict, but what it just shows is just how complex all of this is to sort out. And from my standpoint, I think that it goes back to something that we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast, and that is that if you're an IT leader, part of the challenge is that this isn't all you're doing. So another report that you found was from Flexera, and it's a lengthy report, but basically their 2025 IT priorities. And I found it absolutely fascinating that the top two issues that enterprise IT leaders are grappling with is on the one hand is integrating in AI, right? Integrating AI, bringing it in and making it pay off, everything we just talked about. And then the second thing is dealing with IT spend. How do they manage their IT spend? And we'll talk more about the IT spend part in a second, but I thought it was just interesting that Flexera, I think, did us a good job because they weren't narrowly looking at just AI of sort of all of it in balance. And I think this is the real issue facing IT leaders today.
Yes, Flexera does this study every year, as well as a related one that they acquired from their RightScale acquisition around cloud costs. And Flexera, their core work is around IT asset management. So they don't really care what you use, other than them, of course, on the IT asset side. But other than that, they just want to see what everybody is doing from an enterprise-wide perspective, from an investment perspective. I found it very interesting that they found that when they talked to their IT leaders, their panels, their community, 90% of them said that the skill sets of their employees need to evolve to use AI correctly, despite the fact that 85% of them said that they're ready to leverage generative AI. Again, we see a gap between leadership preparation and prior work versus employee readiness to take advantage of what is happening there or to even know what IT has prepared.
Yeah, I think there's, and we're seeing little hints of this. I mean, not even hints. I think we're seeing this surface all over the place. I think the whole movement around agentic AI. We're just talking about Salesforce and Agentforce. It's all predicated on this idea that you're going to go and deliver this tool set that allows an organization to create these army of agents. And I'm skeptical that a lot of the rank and file knowledge workers are in fact going to have an interest and desire in doing that. I think there's so much fear still out there, or B, have the actual ability to do it in terms of it. And it's not technical, right? I think people like Salesforce have done a great job of making it accessible, but there's still a secondary process of being able to sort of think that way and actually build that out. And so I think you see all these counterpoints happening, and I think it's making the job of being a CIO and navigating this very, very challenging. And that's just as true on something that I know is near and dear to your heart, and that is the spending question. That was another one that I think came up in this report that it was just like my mind is going. So the number two issue is that technology, that their headline in the report, technology spend is keeping IT leaders up at night, right? That there's just massive concern about this massive growth across all of this SaaS, cloud, iPaaS, infrastructure, all of it. And I think they said the number one, security, right? All of this concern. And then what's the number four finding? That only a small number of leaders are actually engaging in FinOps and doing, i.e., they're worried about it, but they're not doing anything about it. And it's just like, I just don't understand.
Yes, so at Amalgam Insights, one of the core precepts that we have based the entire company on when I started it in 2017 is the IT rule of 30. Every IT spend category that is unmanaged averages about 30% in waste when you look across the bills, the late fees, the contracts, the products that are chosen, the zero usage things, the duplicate use things, just going across the board. And it has been true for my entire IT career that when you dig in and actually do the work, it's about 30%. When Flexera asked their IT leaders, how much are you guessing are you wasting across data center, SaaS, IaaS, desktop? They guessed a little bit less, 22 to 25%. I obviously I think they're underestimating just a little bit, but still, let's call it 20%. If everybody is wasting 20%, that is still a gigantic amount, and it speaks to the lack of control that IT has over its own spend. Even though everybody knows better, it's hard to manage that in the moment.
Well, I think what is interesting about the entire space, and I think that AI is going to complicate this even further, is that we've talked about this in the past. The complexity of the stack has just gotten so out of control, and in a way that we can't use the traditional approaches to solve for, right? To solve for that. Historically, we would always have these periods of explosion. New technologies would come out, it would cause a bunch of investment, and we'd go do these things, and then we'd rationalize. We'd take a step back and we'd consolidate and rationalize and simplify. And while there's still some of that, M&A type activity, you have multiple ERPs or CRMs or whatever, you may consolidate that. I think what we're seeing is this massive explosion of like brand new categories of tech that aren't replacing anything. They're just brand new. And now we're seeing this sprawl, this growth. And so I think it's making the job of managing all of this difficult. And then you have this whole consumption element that everything is now SaaS or consumption based in some way. And it's causing this explosion in spending and this explosion in really in usage. And I think overall that's good, right? I think, one of the things we've often talked about is that even FinOps is mostly focused on the cost management, but what we do a really poor job in IT is connecting how much we're spending to how much we're generating,
Right.
and which makes that something that you can now actually manage against. So I think it's an interesting, challenging space, and I think we're going to see because of it more and more movement in these areas. And so there were a couple of acquisitions in this space that I know this is your area. So maybe you want to walk us through these acquisitions and what you think they mean.
Yeah, one of the most interesting ones I saw this week was around AppDirect announcing the acquisition of a company called vCom Solutions, a leading company in the telecom and managed mobility space. And to provide some context, I saw an interesting quote from a Constellation Research event. A guy named Ashwin Rangan, who you are very familiar with, who you've interviewed in the past, Charlie. He stated that at the Constellation's recent annual event, I think the CIO role is becoming the chief cat herder role. The CIO is turning into a chief procurement officer for technology versus the joy of innovation. The innovation track is being disrupted by trying to figure out how to buy all of this stuff. So, in response, there are marketplaces that are showing up that seek to simplify the purchase of IT. AppDirect is one of these big ones. they've got 1,000 employees. They manage billions and billions in spend across cloud and SaaS. And what they've brought in vCom to do in this acquisition is to also further help with network, telecom, and mobility spend, where that's $1 trillion global market. It's commoditized to some extent. It's not growing as fast as the rest of IT, but it's still this gigantic quarter of the IT budget overall. So now you have this, call it 150 person team who can help specifically with those network and mobility challenges, as well as provide advisors to help with that purchasing. Because at the end of the day, frankly, CIOs don't really care about negotiating with the likes of Verizon and AT&T and Vodafone on top of the gazillion other headaches that exist around AI and low code apps and all of these other things that are frankly more interesting to the company as a whole.
Well, and I'd argue that the average CIO doesn't want to be spending the time negotiating any of this. I mean, I think there are definitely some that have sort of like made their name by, beating up vendors and getting the cost down. But at the end of the day, your mandate should be to drive value for the organization, and an incremental cost savings, is just that, an incremental cost savings. It's not really how you're generating this sort of exponential value. But one of the things, I mean, and Ashley's a great guy, and he's always been this very sort of innovation oriented mindset. And I think he's been very successful as the CIO because of that. And I think it's also pointing out, I mean, I think this is our trend, or our theme for this episode is the balancing act, right? Because this is also pointing to another balancing act. So one of the other things in the Flexera report, one of the other major findings or issues was that CIOs and IT organizations continue to struggle with innovation, of actually continuing to push that. And I think this is why, right? We get so much of our time and energy is sucked into these operational things, managing the stack itself, managing the spend, dealing with all of these elements. And it makes it really, really hard if that's what you're spending all of your time doing, that you then have no resources to actually go out and do the things that are leveraging that technology to drive value for the organization. And I think this has been the challenge within IT for generations now. And so it's going to be a continuing battle. And one of the reasons, we've talked about this before, I'm big on FinOps, particularly if you break it out of the cloud world and say, we're going to use this discipline for everything, because it gives you a way to manage and control and to do that in the context of what your innovation agenda is.
Right. But there's always been this challenge of figuring out what is that value at the end of the day. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault per se, other than that IT has been treated more as a commodity than as a value driver, despite all the hype. Everybody talks about how technology provides value, but then at the end of the day, when you ask the CIO, how does this align to our cost of goods sold and our revenue and our profit, you get a lot of blank stares.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, here's what I think is great though. If you are a CIO or an IT leadership, if you can get yourself centered on that, then suddenly it starts illuminating pathways for you. And one of the other acquisitions was Cloudera acquiring Octopai's data lineage business, right? Well, I guess their whole business, which their business is data lineage and data cataloging. And what I think is interesting is, we've talked a lot about how critical data is to this, right? I think data is one of two core value drivers for the enterprise today, data and workflows. And so I think it's interesting to see, again, this balancing act of, on the one hand, I've got the management layer of being able to manage and control my data. And then that's the necessary component to enable the ability to then take that data and leverage it in a way that creates value. And I think, I actually am a fan of this acquisition, because I think this sort of completes Cloudera's portfolio, because I believe you have to have all this in one place. I mean, this space has historically been very segmented, and it has never aligned to the way a CIO needs to function. A CIO needs to look at their data landscape, their data architecture and pipelines as a unified whole. And so I think this acquisition is smart for Cloudera, because it potentially gives them the ability to do that.
Yes. So when I look at the data value chain as from a FinOps perspective and from a categorical perspective, it's just such a mess to think about the database, the data prep, the data integration, the data quality, the data catalog, the analytics, the machine learning, the modeling, the low code app and no code apps, the API management. It's like, how the heck do I ever get from here to here in a governed, entrusted manner when there's 13 or 15 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 different solutions that I've got to use just to get from here to here? It's really frustrating. And I think that's part of where Cloudera has really succeeded in its, call it, post Hadoop phase. Obviously, Hadoop is no
Like that.
longer, it's no longer a dominant data source. And, Cloudera knows that. And they had to shift to figure out, what do we do next if we aren't going to die? So they became this highly governed end-to-end data platform. And they said, we're going to hang our hat on governance, not Hadoop anymore. But they realized there's some pieces that were missing. So I think this data source and data connector and data lineage piece is an important one, because we are headed towards an AI future where, honestly, we're going to ask for a lot of stuff through GenAI, and the rest of it is going to be super abstracted. I don't care which app it comes from or which set of apps my answer comes from, as long as it reflects what my enterprise data is really talking about, and as long as that can be trusted at the end of the day. So this really helps Cloudera to bring in more data sources more quickly while retaining this governed environment. Really good.
Well,
Yeah.
I do think it's going to be super interesting because, in our pre-planning, you said, is AI evolving this whole space? And I think it is, but maybe, I'm curious, maybe not in the same way you think so, because to me, what's really happening is that we've always had this sort of separation between the data architects and the data team that was responsible for massaging the data, collecting, massaging it, doing all the work that had to be done so that we could then consume that data via BI platforms or whatever. Well, I think GenAI is going to up the ante substantially further, right? So, Lineage was always this sort of connective tissue that allowed us, like, at the point of consumption, to say, hey, can we trust this data? Well, GenAI, particularly with its penchant for hallucination, just changes the dynamic entirely, where it's like, now we need to have that automated. We need to be 100% sure, so that if we're leveraging RAG or some other mechanism to consume that data into these GenAI platforms, that we can count on it. And so I think it is going to completely make the process so much more critical, and risky as well. So, and I think that extends across the board. So some other industry news is that ServiceNow made another announcement, and what was interesting about it is that also all around governance, in this case AI governance. So they introduced a set of three, I don't know what you'd call them, tool sets, classes. I don't know what they would be. Capabilities, I guess they're calling them.
Tools. Yeah.
Yeah. So, to all focus on governance, and you brought this up, and you obviously think this is a smart thing for them.
Yeah. So it's not that what I'm about to say is not going to be a super big surprise to anybody in IT, but ServiceNow has come out with these three capabilities. Now Assist Guardian, which is providing AI guardrails and getting rid of offensive content, adding additional security. They're adding a data kit to help consume data for AI, and they're adding analytics so you can see the adoption of AI. And although that's not groundbreaking from a market-based perspective, I do think that having all of those abilities in one place is going to be an expectation for enterprise applications going forward. Whether it's ServiceNow or Workday or SAP or Oracle, if you do not provide all of these capabilities to support AI from the get-go and make it obvious how to use them at not just a very specific niche level, but at an enterprise at an executive visibility level, I don't think AI is going to work in your enterprise application.
So what's interesting about this, and this is where I agree with part of what you're saying. I agree with the standpoint that this is a necessary function that does not exist in most organizations. We've talked about the challenge with AI governance in the enterprise, and I think those challenges are not yet resolved and won't be for any time, is for no other reason the fact that the overarching regulatory and compliance world is not clear on any of it yet. So there that level of governance can't even happen. But even at the level that ServiceNow is trying to address it, my challenge is that ServiceNow is basically trying to put this out as governance strictly for the AI capabilities within the ServiceNow ecosystem. And
Mhm.
that's well and good for what they're doing. But I think the big issue with AI is that it is at its nature, and at least in my view of where it needs to go, is that it's transcendent. It's not living in any one system. And so while I agree with everything, and maybe this is what their plan, but to me, that needs to be an independent environment. I need to have a dedicated AI governance tool set environment, something that is doing this across all my enterprise apps that are doing it. So that's my question. Is this really going to become the new standard that every enterprise app has to have? Or is this that we're going to need to be relying on some third party to do it to actually get to the level we need to be at?
Yeah, it's no secret that applications have sprawled out of control. The average enterprise now has over 1,000 applications at that multi-billion-dollar revenue level, and it is going to be difficult to figure out how to govern that unless you are asking for all the applications to integrate into your application, and then ServiceNow also becomes the next Oracle database
Which I think
from
I
a
think they
practical
probably
perspective.
are in favor of that. So maybe that's their big master plan.
Uh huh.
Yeah, I think it's challenging. I think it's a tough space.
hmm Yes. This combination of trying to figure out how to govern AI and then how to deal with the orchestration of all of these agents that are going to be created across all of these different platforms. Yeah, it feels like we're working our way slowly to a new AI middle management layer, which is going to add a different type of complexity to AI. So we get to abstract certain bits, but now we're going to add another. We're changing the level of detail.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, and like I said, I'm not slamming on what they're doing. I think the fact that they're doing anything with AI governance is, good for them, and I do agree with you from the standpoint that they are addressing a very either what is a very real concern or what will be a very real concern for enterprise leaders in the very near future, because you do not have to go very far down this road
Yep.
before you start recognizing the challenges around it. I just think it's not going to be nearly that simple unless you're willing to go all in on and take your pick, right? I mean, if it's Salesforce, if it's ServiceNow, or any of the major players, and say
hmm
this is where everything comes through. But as we both know, in the typical enterprise, that isn't what happens. And so the question
Right.
is, then what? And speaking of sprawl, other industry news, a company that we both know and I'm a huge fan of called Aera Technology. They're off radar in most cases because they've historically played in decision intelligence within specific to supply chains, and always, I mean, they were so far ahead of the industry, in my opinion, of their leveraging of AI and of algorithms to effectively create this abstraction layer that enabled effective decision making. And I think they've executed on this very well. But like many companies, they were caught, I don't want to say flat-footed, but they sort of got overtaken by this whole massive hype around AI. And so
hmm
they are sort of responding to that. And on their last briefing, you could sort of hear the frustration of like, we were here first and, we're not catching up. We were already here kind of a stuff. But they have a new announcement that they introduced agentic AI, a bunch of stuff. But the two that I'm most interested in is that they're using an agentic AI platform or extending their agentic AI platform to enable decision intelligence more broadly now than supply chain. So they were giving example use cases that were very far afield, anywhere effectively that decisions have to be made within the enterprise. And as you can imagine, that's a lot of them. That's a lot of coverage. And so super, super interesting. And then the one that I'm super excited about and interested in is what they're calling workspaces. And this is something that I believe we're going to end up in. And this is this idea, this sort of AI fueled platform or portal that a knowledge worker goes to, that the system is using AI to sort of bring contextual data into to allow you to function, in their case, to make decisions. And so, early days, and I think they're I don't want to say treading on thin ice. I think they're about to go into the lion's den, because they're going to get out of their kind of safe swim lane where they were largely alone, and now in a world where they can easily be conceived as competing with the sales forces of the world, at least at certain levels. And so I think that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I've covered decision intelligence probably last 5 or 6 years. And there have been a number of players that have come up in the space, including Aera. But the challenge was that, honestly, a lot of them were very narrowly focused on specific areas and were not general tools. I would say that's part of Aera's challenge, that in they could have been a solution that took on the Tableaus and Power BIs of the world and said, we're going to give you the actual information that these solutions are claiming to provide from an analytic discovery perspective. But that's not how they go to market. They went to market as a supply chain specific capability, and perhaps with some focus on planning. So honestly, my biggest problem with all the decision intelligence vendors is that they either thought too small, or didn't focus on their actual end user, who is the line of business user who is trying to find insights and directional actionable information. And that's not where they've been going so far. So they've either been outflanked by the likes of Tableau and Power BI on one side, or the likes of Slack and Teams on the other, providing some sort of collaborative capability. So I'm hoping this is a step forward, because what Aera is providing is actually differentiated and useful for the end user community, but it's something they've got to start talking about in greater detail. Like, you're talking about these briefings. I've never been on an Aera briefing, so I don't know who they reach out to.
I'll make an introduction for you. What is interesting is I think part of the challenge that Aera has, and again, this whole space, is the idea of decision intelligence is a difficult one to sort of get your head around, right? When and where do we make decisions? And I think that's why they landed on supply chain like as a starting point, because it was they're very clear decision points. Do I order more product or not? Do I move the product from one warehouse to another, right? It was these very clearly delineated decision points that they could then enable both intelligence around and ultimately automate. Right. And so now the question for them is, can they extend that? Can they find those other use cases elsewhere in the enterprise? And I think the answer is going to be yes. I think it's actually super, super powerful. But I think you are correct that their challenge is really in the storytelling about how do they communicate that in a way where it's clear where that's occurring and how that's happening. And I would argue that if I look at the BI tools, my complaint around the Tableaus and what have you of the world has always been that it's like, you're giving me data, but what I want is a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And Aera is trying to solve for that. So I think it's interesting. I'm like I said, I'm a fan, and I wish them the best with this. But I do think they're jumping into the deep end of the pool, and they're going to have to fight off some sharks now. But
what I really like about what they're doing is that they are between two different IT paradigms. We have the dashboard paradigm, which just shows you kind of some static views. You can make them real time if you really try, but at the same time, you're stuck with kind of these 6 views of the world. And then on the other side, you've got building your own apps. So we've talked about no code and low code apps for a while, but what if you want something kind of in the middle, something that is interactive, but not something where I, as the subject matter expert, have to actually put time to build it in great detail? And this is the promise that Tableau provided on being able to explore your data in greater detail. Aera is actually building that out now, but having that understanding of what they're doing and then being able to sell it is going to be a challenge, because everybody's heard so many promises across BI and AI.
So let's talk about somebody who's not having any trouble selling their vision and technology, and that is apparently NVIDIA. We always like to end on a few lighter things. So we have three short hits here, or well, two short ones and a maybe an interesting one. But the first one is NVIDIA. NVIDIA has now become by valuation the largest company in the world. And my only question, I mean, I guess I'm a fan of NVIDIA. I mean, I respect what they've been doing, but I sit here and say all the AI hype, all the AI hype aside, do they really deserve to be the biggest company by valuation in the world? I struggle with that. If I look at, there are some of their competitors who have such a much broader footprint in terms of impact and volume and just producing real stuff. I just, no disrespect to NVIDIA, I just really struggle with whether or not they deserve this valuation. So I don't know what your thought was.
Yeah, so I looked up NVIDIA's price to earnings ratio this morning, and it is 68, meaning the price of their stock is 68 times their annual profits. So basically, market cap is supposed to theoretically, from a finance perspective, be a summation of the future cash flows of a company. So you are betting that NVIDIA has in its future 68 times its annual profits for this year. And to do that, you have to sell more than just a chip. You have to sell an ecosystem, and you have to have a plan for, honestly, this kind of order of magnitude growth that Apple has been fantastic at. Apple has a device, of course, but there's an entire ecosystem around Apple that justifies expanding past 10 or 15 times price per earnings. So that's what people are saying, whether they realize it or not, when they're trading NVIDIA stock. They're saying NVIDIA has this next generation story for revenue, for stuff that they're going to sell that is going to be buku bucks and way more than what they are selling now. I find that story difficult to justify at this point. Am I going to buy software from NVIDIA that is 3 times as much as the amount that I'm buying chips for? It's like, that's kind of what you're thinking.
Yeah, no, I like I said, I think they are overvalued and overhyped right now, and I that is not to diminish the long-term potential. I think there's no question there's a ton of runway left here. But as we started the show with, there's still a lot of mixed signals, a lot of question marks as to how this ends up manifesting. Certainly wouldn't expect any short-term impact, but to your point, that whatever it was 68 times, that's buying out a long way, and it's hard to see that far out. So I do find that somewhat suspect and challenging. And then to end our show, we'll end on the other end of the spectrum, a piece of some controversial news that was made even more controversial by someone that you and I both know. So the news is that Freshworks announced a layoff of about 12 or 13% of their staff. So a pretty sizable layoff. That part isn't all that unusual. There's lots of layoffs going on. But what is unusual is that amid a growth rate of 20%, $1 billion in cash reserve, and announcing a $400 million stock buyback, right? Meaning that all the signals from an investment perspective are pretty solid, right? Maybe not spectacular, but not, they're not losing money. They're not having any major threat. And yet they go through this layoffs. And to add some fuel to the fire, Sridhar Vembu, who is the CEO of Zoho, someone who you and I both know and have met several times, went on Twitter and basically blasted the heck out of Freshworks for doing this. And if you aren't familiar with Zoho, they are, part of their ethos is they're private. They're very deliberately private. They go out of their way of saying they're private because it allows them to invest in their people. And, knowing Sridhar, I think that this sort of hit him almost personally, right? Freshworks, while technically, I guess, a US based company, heavy function in India, largely viewed as an Indian company. And I feel like he actually had a personal reaction to this. And then, of course, the drama back and forth, people on LinkedIn were sort of hitting back to Sridhar going, you should be bashing your competitor because they do compete. And, it was just sort of the drama going off. But I thought it was a fascinating, mostly because I think it's a real conversation that people should be having. It's is a company that is doing well, is profitable, is making money, is growing. Is it appropriate for them to do a layoff like that? I mean, I don't know how you reacted to any of it.
Yeah, so I've been a hiring manager for the past decade plus at this point, and to me, the hard part is why did you hire these people if you thought they were so expendable that you could get rid of 10% of them while the company's growing 20% per year? It's like something is really broken in your company, and either your hiring is very broken or your road to growth is somehow confused. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but it's not really a positive story to say that when you're growing that you're gonna get rid of the people who got you there, unless like either your company can work on remote at this point and maybe you should be laying off half your company, or like you just no, I'm just being honest here. It's like as a business manager, I think like if you're firing that many people or laying off that many people, like there's something that has fundamentally changed at your company, or you're fundamentally confused about what made your company successful.
Well, it is interesting, right? And I've long respected Zoho's approach to how they do it. A very, I guess you'd call it, human approach to business, which is fairly unusual in the tech industry. But by the same token, I think that there is a case to be made. I mean, Freshworks is while they do compete with Zoho in some ways, they're not completely competitive, and they're in a space that is filled with sharks. They're swimming in a sea of sharks. And there's a fair argument to be made that they are behind right now on adopting AI and embedding it into their platforms, and that they need to be making some serious, righting of the ship around that. Schroeder's point, however, I think was also super valid. He said, hey, you have this $400 million buyback. Why not put that $400 million into some growth initiative where you can keep these employees and actually build for the future? I think it's very hard to judge on it, but it definitely, if nothing else, highlights the choices that CEOs have in terms of the ethos they bring to how they operate, and the difference, very bluntly, I think, between a public company and a privately held one, because clearly Freshworks being public is under pressure to have growth greater than 20%, and that sort of leads to this as well. So we'll see what kind of impact this has in the market and how people react and respond to it.
Yeah, and I think there's a challenge there, both in that companies need to hire people with the expected growth mindset that the company has. If you're going to say we have to grow 20% a year, you hire people who are expected to improve themselves 20% per year, which is not an easy ask. But also, I think part of that is part of the having a good hiring process. The other thing is there's always a little bit of flux that happens in companies year after year. I think 10% is a lot, but there's always going to be a little something, a couple percent per year where unfortunately some skill sets aren't going to be used, and then you're going to need to hire that. There's always going to be a little bit of that happening, but there's obviously a trend right now in big tech where companies are trying to see how much they can get away with, I think, from a layoff perspective. And hopefully that does not continue. I think it is a little overblown at this point that companies with a lot of money are trying to cut to the bone and just see what happens.
Yeah, I think it goes all the way back to where we started. I think that what you see is just a whole lot of mixed signals, and I think everyone is struggling to find the right pathway forward. And I guess between Zoho and Freshworks, I guess time will tell which one of them is taking that right approach.
Yes, as both of them are quite successful right now. So we shall see. And on that, I guess not super optimistic note, thank you for joining us.
Inquisitive note.
Yes, on that inquisitive note for the future. Thank you so much for joining us this week for This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you enjoyed what you heard or wanted us to hear something else, let us know, like, subscribe, comment, and please email us. We're always ready to hear from you. So thanks a lot. Take care.